Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Sokolow, and I'm the director of the McGillicuddy Humanities Center at the University of Maine. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's event with Janine and Giovanni, co-sponsored by the University of Maine Alumni Association, the University of Maine Department of Communication and Journalism, and the McGillicuddy Humanities Center. Before we get started with the official introductions, I'd like to do a few things. First, I need to make everyone aware that this event is being recorded. The second thing I'd like to do is to read the University of Maine's official acknowledgement of the land. The University of Maine recognizes that it is located on Marsh Island in the homeland of the Penobscot Nation, where issues of water and territorial rights and encroachment upon sacred sites are ongoing. Penobscot homeland is connected to the other Wabanaki tribal nations, the Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac, through kinship, alliances, and diplomacy. The university also recognizes that the Penobscot Nation and the other Wabanaki tribal nations are distinct, sovereign, legal, and political entities with their own powers of self-governance and self-determination. Okay, the third and final thing I'd like to do is let you know about the Allan Miller Fund Visiting Journalism Program, which is funding today's event. It was established in 2007 by alumna Ann Lucy in memory of her late husband, Allan Miller. The program celebrates Allan Miller's legacy at the University of Maine. Allan Miller taught journalism at the University of Maine for more than 2 decades, and he served several years as chair of the journalism department and advisor for the Maine campus, which is our student newspaper. He was an enthusiastic supporter of the idea of bringing experienced veteran journalists into the classroom, into the campus newsroom, and to campus for public events in order to motivate and excite our aspiring young University of Maine journalists. I'm proud that for 14 years, this program has delivered on its original promise, and I know several of our young journalism students are excited to hear from such an esteemed alumna today. Thank you for joining us and honoring Allan Miller's legacy in this manner today. And with that, I'll turn it over to John Diamond of the Alumni Association to introduce our 2021 Allan Miller Fund visiting journalist, Janine Giovanni.
Thanks, Dr. Sokolow, and welcome everybody. I am John Diamond. I'm the president and CEO of the UMaine Alumni Association. We're especially pleased to co-host this year's Allan Miller Lecture. Allan was an extremely well-liked and respected member of UMaine's journalism faculty, as Mike just mentioned. He influenced countless journalists and communication professionals in Maine and beyond, myself included. Allan was my professor for multiple classes during my undergraduate days, and afterwards he was my friend and mentor. Thanks to faculty such as Mike Sokolow, Paul Grossweiler, and others in UMaine's Department of Communication and Journalism, Allan's pursuit of the truth, accountability, and journalistic excellence continues on. We're excited that this year's Allan Miller visiting lecturer is a person with a special connection to the Alumni Association. Last year, Janine Giovanni was selected to receive our Dr. Bernard Lown Humanitarian Award. It's one of the highest honors that we can bestow on an alumna or an alumnus. Her selection was based on her decades of work as a war correspondent, commentator, and author, exploring conflict and exposing atrocities committed on multiple continents. In a moment, you'll hear directly from Janine on what she saw, but first, let me give you a little bit of background about her. I'll start with the easy part. Janine is a New Jersey native and a 1983 graduate of UMaine, where she majored in English. She's currently a senior fellow and professor at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. It gets more complicated when you try to summarize her list of accomplishments, accolades, and honors that separate her Orono days from her New Haven days. Let me just give you a few of those. A war correspondent and writer for the Times of London, The Spectator, The New York Times, National Geographic, Wall Street Journal, and many more. A contributing editor for Newsweek and Vanity Fair. A documentary filmmaker and the subject of documentary films. The author of 7 books and at least 1 currently in the works. A subject matter expert for several international policy and research organizations. An Edward R. Murrow Press Fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations, a prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship, the recipient of the Hay Medal for Prose, the Courage in Journalism Award, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters 2020 Blake Dodd Prize. There's much more that I could say about Janine and all of the honors that she's received and all the accomplishments that she's achieved over the last several decades. but we want to leave plenty of time for you to hear from her and to allow her to address your questions. Now, you can pose those questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So enter those questions at any time, and depending on how much time we have, Janine will respond to as many as possible. So with all of that, it's my honor to introduce to you Janine D. Giovanni.
Thank you so much, John and Mike. It really, for me, is an honor to be here. I wish I was on the UMO campus where I passed, 4, actually 5 very happy years, but here we are in COVID times. So first of all, I think, I want to tell you a little bit about my career and the trajectory that took me to where I am today. I'm coming to you from New York City. I've just finished actually, I think it's my 8th or 9th book. And I am a columnist at Foreign Policy. I am indeed a senior fellow at Yale. And I'm very much what I think of myself as a humanitarian and a human rights activist. So how did that happen? When I arrived at Maine, all I knew is that I wanted to be a writer. I didn't know how one accomplished that. I had no idea how you got a column on a newspaper or how you interviewed anyone. All of this I didn't know any journalists in the world I came from. I just knew that from an early age, I wanted to write and I wanted to express myself. And I think that I had a small talent for it, even as a kid. But what I had more than anything was determination and perseverance, because for all of you out there who are writers, trying to be writers, budding writers, the biggest, the strongest words of encouragement I can give you are don't give up and try, keep going. Because the number of times that one gets rejected, you have to be able to pick yourself up and say, I'm going to, put this aside and move on to the next project. And that probably, to be a professional writer, that and discipline are the 2 biggest attributes one can possibly have. Because if you want to be a writer, you have to get used to an editor not liking your story or someone ignoring your letter or your pitch and not taking it personally. A publisher doesn't want to publish your book, or you can't find an agent, or you can't even get your first story published. You have to somehow plow through that and believe in yourself and know that your words and your actions will make a difference. The second most important thing, something I did not have at Orono, is discipline. Discipline for a writer, especially because it is a very self-directed profession. Your boss is yourself, unless you're working for a newspaper or a magazine, in which case you have an editor over your shoulder saying your deadline was yesterday. But if you're a self-directed writer, it means that you need to carve out in your life the time, the space, and the quiet so that you can create and can become a writer. I was thinking, recently about that I achieved the dream I wanted as a little girl, which was to be a professional writer. And I say professional because I earn my living as a writer. I don't have a trust fund. I don't have a rich husband. I just basically everything I earn from my writing is what my son and I live on. And I'm very proud that I've done that because it's not an easy task. That, and I really think that this strong belief in yourself is so important. But I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about how from Maine, how I then entered the world of being a foreign correspondent and to what I am now, which is, I would say more of a human rights reporter and a humanitarian. And my main focus right now is preserving evidence from war crimes to be used in later war crime tribunals. But first, I was a young writer, and from Maine, I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is this very elite program training poets and fiction writers. In those days, I wanted to be a fiction writer. But very early on, at the age of 23 or 24, I realized that being a fiction writer is a very lonely profession, and I wanted to get into the world. I wanted to see what was out there. And at this point, the Berlin Wall was coming down, 1989. So I basically went to Europe. with another UMO graduate, Mark Schlossman, who became my husband. He's a photographer. And we went to London just literally as Eastern Europe was crumbling. The Soviet Union was falling apart. And my first assignment, which we kind of took ourselves on, was in the West Bank and Gaza. It was the first Intifada, the first Arab uprising against the occupation in Israel. And as a very young journalist who didn't know the Middle East and the complexities of the Middle East, it was very, very complicated. But what I did was focused on one woman who really became a kind of guiding light in the rest of my career, because I wanted to be like her. And she is now passed away, but she was a Jewish Holocaust survivor who went on to become a lawyer. And she was the only lawyer representing Palestinians in military court at that time. And her name was Felicia Langer. And she believed more than anything in justice and in giving a voice to the voiceless. So she said to me, a very young journalist, if you have the ability to go somewhere and record the voices and the stories of people who do not have the ability to tell their own stories, then you have an obligation. And those words stuck with me. So I wrote a profile of her, and I was very fortunate that an agent saw it and commissioned me to write a book. My very first book was about the occupation, told from both sides, from the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. And that basically set me on a path of writing about state terror and its effect on ordinary people. Because really, war correspondent makes you think of, to me, I think of someone who follows a soldier or becomes embedded with the US Army. And that's never what I did. I embedded with people, with communities, with families, with who were in the middle of war, because that to me was so much more interesting and more heroic in a way. I mean, I'm not saying anything that soldiers are not heroic. I'm just saying that ordinary people trying to live their lives, their resilience, their endurance, their ability to survive or not to survive were the stories I wanted to focus on. So from Israel, I went to Bosnia. And in 1995, the war in Bosnia started, and it was a tragic, horrific, bloody war, which broke my heart. And I based myself in Sarajevo, which at that point was under siege. Now, what does it mean to be under siege? It meant that the city was encircled by tanks and Serbian fighters, and they were shelling the city relentlessly. There was no water, there was no electricity, there was no heat, and it was as cold as Orono. Sarajevo had been in 1984 an Olympic city for Winter Olympics. So you can imagine how cold, and if a building has been unheated for a year, then it was 2 years, then it was 3 years of war. People literally froze to death. And when I got there, I realized what I wanted to do was record every day what was happening, what people ate, how many people died, how many shells fell, the stories of ordinary people. The woman who was washing dishes at her kitchen sink who got shot by a sniper. The children who went out to play to build a snowman the first day that the shelling stopped, and then a shell came in and killed them all. The heroics of a teenage swimmer who was hit by shrapnel and had to have part of her chest removed. A young girl called Zlata, who was 13 when I met her, and who was writing a diary about what it was like to come of age during the siege of Sarajevo. And of course, many of you might have read her book. Zlata's diary became an international bestseller. And Zlata is now in her 30s. But, you know, to see the war through the eyes of a child, you know, she was a kind of Bosnian Anne Frank. After Bosnia, I went to Rwanda and witnessed the genocide in 1994, where 1 million people, 1 million souls were slaughtered in the course of 3 months. It was horrific. It was my first trip to Africa. From there, I went back to Bosnia and kept reporting the end of the Bosnian War, which culminated in another genocide in Srebrenica. And by the way, I urge all of you to watch a film which was shortlisted last night for the Oscars, Quo Vadis Aida, which is about 3 days that shamed the world, when basically the UN and the international community walked away and allowed 8,000 men and boys to be slaughtered. And that event and the Bosnian War never really left me. And it kind of set my path for writing as a human rights reporter, and as someone that desperately wanted to have my work be seen so that it could affect policy. And the Bosnian War did that. I really think, unlike the war in Syria, which I also reported, the Bosnian War was probably the last war where journalists had a real impact on President Clinton's decision to then intervene and help end the war. So after Bosnia, I went to Africa for a long time, and I worked in most of the terrible, terrible wars of the 1990s, Somalia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Ivory Coast, Liberia, all through West Africa, Nigeria, Burundi, Rwanda again. And as I got older and more experienced, I learned how to become a better reporter. And I learned things that I think every journalism student will learn along the way, but I wish someone had told me about it then, which was things like, how do you interview victims of extreme trauma? You know, if you're coming to the site of a mass grave that's being exhumed, how do you talk to people without re-traumatizing them further? If you come to a village that has just been burnt down, but you see a lone survivor, how do you get evidence of what happened without injuring them more? I worked a lot on sexual violence during wartime, meaning I worked with victims of rape, but systematic rape, where, for instance, in Bosnia, women were held in rape camps and raped up to 16 times a day with the intention of them getting pregnant so that they would bear Serbian children or mixed children. So the intention was to break the Bosnian Muslim ethnic strain. Same thing happened in Rwanda. So these are very dark topics. And I wish also, in a way, someone early on had told me how to protect myself. Because if you witness this much darkness and this much horror, it's inevitable that you come away deeply scarred by it. And I did. So in 1999 to 2000 were terrible years in terms of war, because I started with the war in Kosovo, and I embedded with a unit of rebel soldiers, and our unit was accidentally hit. NATO, who was fighting on the side of the Kosovo rebels, accidentally bombed our unit because they had taken a position the night before, and the bomb hit and it killed, I think, 17 soldiers in my unit. And so we were basically hiding in a trench for 3 days while this bombing continued, and while we were helping mop up the dead and the wounded. And that resulted, I wrote 2 long pieces, one in Vanity Fair called Madness Visible, which won the National Magazine Award, but then became a book, a longer book, which is also called Madness Visible. From Kosovo, I went to East Timor, on the very tip of the Indonesian islands, very close to Australia, Darwin, so really far away, where a very violent uprising was taking place over independence for the island. And from there, I ended the year in Chechnya, where the Chechens were basically fighting for independence against Russians. As I later would see throughout my career, Russia spares no one. And the bombing in Chechnya, in the capital Grozny, was some of the worst aerial bombardment I've ever witnessed. And I hope many of you have never been in aerial bombardment, because it's a horrific thing. You never forget the sound of how loud bombs are, and how easily it kills people. And the memory I take away with me from that time was that I stumbled into a house full of blind people, and they had been, actually, it had been, before they were bombed, a house of the blind, an institute for blind people. But they had been bombed by the Russians, and there was no roof and no walls. And of course, blind people are used to touchstones, so they couldn't They couldn't even get out of their seats. And they were sitting there when I found them. And Grozny also was freezing. And this was January, so really cold. They were sitting in their coats and their hats and their gloves, holding their white sticks. And I came in and I said, "What are you waiting for?" And they said, "We're waiting for someone to save us." So I wrote very passionately about Chechnya, and it resulted in me getting expelled, never again allowed to go to Russia, which I see as a badge of honor, actually. When I tried to go back, and after 9/11, I was on my way to Afghanistan, and I flew through Moscow to get to Tajikistan, and I was taken off the plane in Moscow, marched into an interrogation room, and thankfully they marched me back onto the plane and said, "Never come back here again, ever." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Chechnya." So I recently wanted to go back to Russia again, and I was told by someone that they they haven't forgotten. They don't forget these things. So after Grozny, basically, I then concentrated. I really knew that I wanted to write specifically about human rights violations, and in particular, victims of state terror. And then 9/11 happened. And from there, I went literally September 13th or 14th, I was on a plane and then a boat, literally a barge crossing the river Oxus between Tajikistan and Afghanistan, where I joined the Northern Alliance, who were backed by the US, and spent 3 months there working our way to Kabul, where where they toppled the Taliban. And from there, I went to Tora Bora, where Osama bin Laden was hiding, while the Northern Alliance and US troops tried to flush Osama bin Laden out of those caves. A few months later, I found myself in Iraq. Now, when I was a little girl, my parents subscribed to Life magazine, and I used to read those stories and think, wow, I want to be a foreign correspondent that gets called up in the middle of the night and an editor says, "Get on a plane and go there." And I realized, like, around this time that I had become that person. But it wasn't really, it never was fun. But at this point, I was really tired and really exhausted. And in those days, we didn't know much about post-traumatic stress disorder. We didn't know much about taking care of ourselves. And my editors weren't the most enlightened. So they basically sent me from war to war to war to war, with very little time, downtime, and no counseling or anything in between. No debriefing sessions, which is now what happens to war reporters. Iraq, I'd worked in Iraq quite a bit before, during the time of Saddam Hussein, and then was there for the toppling of Saddam. And then I got married and had a baby, and my son Luca is now 17. Combining motherhood with the kind of work I did was a real struggle, mainly because I didn't want to die. I had a responsibility and someone who needed me desperately, and I didn't want to get injured or killed. And meanwhile, around me, my colleagues were getting killed, being gravely wounded. Marie Colvin, a colleague of mine, lost her eye in Sri Lanka. She was later killed in Syria. I had several colleagues who killed themselves because they suffered intense post-traumatic stress disorder. But I kept on going. Although I learned a new rhythm, which was that I no longer did any kind of news. I was only doing long format narrative nonfiction that would take me long dives into subjects. So then I started working more on things like AIDS in India, poor India now with COVID, and trying to do these very deep dives. After the Arab Spring in 2011, where I reported all of them, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and finally ended up in Syria, I decided that I wanted to focus on Syria. So I spent many, many years first working on the regime side until I got kicked out of Bashar al-Assad's Damascus and told never to come back again as well, or I'd be instantly put into a prison cell. I then started crossing over from Turkey illegally to Aleppo, and did that until two of my colleagues, Jim Foley and Steve Sutloff, who took the same route I did, were kidnapped by first Al-Qaeda, then sold to the Islamic State and beheaded. Terrible. So in 2015, I decided that I needed to get more expertise in international law if I was going to report on human rights. So I went back to, as a scholar, a PECA scholar, to Tufts University, Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I got another MA in international relations, which would really help me then, because I then branched out from journalism to humanitarian work, working for the UN, essentially, the United Nations. And my first job was working for the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt, working on the massive refugee crisis that hit that area and then expanded to Europe, starting in about 2013. And I began working for them, producing reports, but doing field work. I mean, primarily I am a field worker, which means I go on the ground and I record what is happening to people. In the case of the UN, you have to do it, of course, in a much more qualitative and quantitative, which is why I went back to Tufts to learn how to do that. But this was the essence of my work. Following that, I was recruited by the Council on Foreign Relations, which is an incredible think tank in New York, which, you know, back in Woodrow Wilson's time was basically the State Department. It was the precursor of the State Department, defining policy. It still does to this day. It's a remarkable place. And from there, I was recruited by Yale, Jackson Institute of Global Affairs, where I teach human rights. But I'm also doing several other projects, one of which I'm very proud of, and I'm going to talk a bit about because it really ties into what I'm doing now, and also to the Humanitarian Award. It's for the United Nations Democracy Fund. And basically I'm training young truth tellers. Well, not all of them are young, but truth tellers in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, to learn how to identify evidence and to write about war crimes in their own countries. Because in many of these countries, the bad guys, the war criminals, are not going to be tried. They're not going to be taken to The Hague or to the International Criminal Court for many reasons, which are too long to get into here. But their day will come, because justice, as you know, Barack Obama always said, and as Martin Luther King is attributed to saying, the long arc of the universe always leads to justice. I'm paraphrasing now, but it bends, but it eventually gets there. And in the case of these bad guys, I think it will get to them. And I'm talking about Bashar al-Assad in Syria, who has murdered, tortured, chemically gassed his own people. So basically, I'm training them so that they can keep the evidence, because journalism in many ways has shifted from the days when I was at UMO. Now it's the days of long format journalism. They still exist. I still do it, but they're rare. And it's more and more about content, writing blogs, which is quick. And that is not what war reporting is, or indeed getting to the heart of the matter, which often takes, you know, a long time. So I hope if those of you are out there trying to do this kind of long format reporting, you're supported, and you can find grants to help you. And there are many, you know, you have to go online and look for them, but they're there, the Pulitzer Center and other places like that. But all of this is really important because it helps us gather evidence, so that when the day comes, we can say, no, you did this because we were there. We saw it. We have the evidence here. We've written it down. We've documented it. And we have the photographs. So on that, I'm going to take you to a slideshow, which was made by my colleague, Nicole Tong, who is a young Hong Kong Chinese woman who I worked with from the beginning in Syria, and in Iraq. We work together a lot. So this is something, my next book is called The Vanishing. It comes out in October in the US. And it's about ancient Christian communities in the Middle East who are being overrun So the Assyrian and the Chaldeans in Iraq, who are overrun by the Islamic State, the Copts in Egypt, who are under threat by their government, and a very tiny community in Gaza of Orthodox and Roman Catholics who are under threat both from the Hamas regime in Gaza and other external forces, the Israeli occupation, of course, which is a huge thing. And my last book, by the way, about Syria is called The Morning They Came for Us. And that title comes from something that many victims of torture told me when they recounted their stories. They would always say, and then the morning they came for me. And I realized that for victims of torture or any kind of abuse, their lives are cut in half. It's the world they knew before they became victims and then survivors, and their life after, which was permanently damaged and scarred. And many of them, I don't want to turn them into victims because they are survivors and they're the bravest people I know. And you can find all my books if you go to my website, which is www.janinedgiovanni.com, and you can order them there if you have any more interest in them. But let's take a look at these slides, which are of a final trip, my last trip to Iraq and Syria. And then I would love to have some questions from you. So Aisha, you could skip that dark screen. Okay, this will give you a sense of the landscape after the Islamic State took over. And of course they were ousted, but this was in the middle of it all. So you'll see, Aisha, you could turn. Yeah, these are refugees. And I kind of ask you to look at their faces and look at the details on them. Really important, like to see these are children. Aisha. This is in Mosul. This is northern Iraq, which of course was overrun by the Islamic State in 2014, and where people were herded up. Catholic Christians were subjugated. Women, as Yazidi women, Christian women, were taken to the capital Raqqa and sold as slaves. Aisha? These are yeah, this is a Kurdish northern Iraq. Aisha? Children in a refugee camp outside of Mosul. Yeah. This, I was trying to remember if this was a reunion, because many people, of course, you don't really understand, but when there's a refugee crisis and your town is being overrun, people just take off in enormous, like hundreds and hundreds of people. The roads are always clogged up with thousands of people. And inevitably, people get separated from their children. So this is a mother who was reunited with her son. Aisha? Yeah, you could see the kind of stoic look on these kids' faces too. Aisha? This trigger warning, this was after a bombing. I believe this is Damascus. I'm sorry, not Damascus, Aleppo. And there is someone who's being carried down the stairs dead. Aisha? So hospitals were targeted. In 2015, the Russians joined the fight on the side of Bashar al-Assad against the Syrian people, the opposition. And one of the main things they targeted was hospitals. Now, this may seem completely counterproductive to you, and it is, as well as being a war crime. But their view was if they killed doctors and they took out an important part of society. So it was part of their terrible strategy to win the war. And makeshift hospitals were set up in basements, in people's houses, and this is one of them. Aisha? Yeah, this is a bombing. So this is Aleppo, and you could see the guy running with his kid because you could see his feet are off the ground. They're literally off the ground. Aisha? These are people looking up at the sky, and what are they looking at? They're looking at barrel bombs being dropped. Another thing that the Russians and Assad specialized in was dropping barrel bombs, which are against, obviously, the Geneva Convention and every other international law, because they are horrific. They're dropped at a low level. They're basically barrels filled with nails, glass, any kind of shrapnel, so that when they land, they're designed to hit the maximum population areas and to hurt as many people as possible. So it was a time before this fall of Aleppo, when barrel bombs were constant, and the fear you could see on people's faces kind of gives you an indication of how scary it was. Next, Aisha. All right, so what really interests me about this photograph is that my eyes are drawn to the kid and that he's wearing only one sandal. And I always think, what happened to that sandal? And then I realize that in the forefront of it is a dead body. And this is in front of a triage hospital that some of you might have seen this film For Sama, a wonderful film, a Syrian filmmaker made for her daughter who was born during this. And this is the hospital where it took place, the triage hospital in Aleppo. Aisha. These are fighters. It's really interesting. Like if you don't embed with conventional armies like the US Army or the British Army, I always embed it with the rebels or the opposition. And what you realize very early on is that they're ordinary people. They're not soldiers. They're not trained soldiers. They are vegetable sellers and teachers and lawyers and students who are just rising up to protect their, in this case, their street. So you can see the sandbags in the distance. And you could see like how ill-equipped they are as well. So in every war I've ever covered, I've always tried to be on the side of these guys, because usually inevitably these are the good guys. They're trying to free their country from some kind of oppression. And this was Aleppo, I believe, in 2014. Next. So the agony of families, of family life. Now, I was trying to remember if this was someone who had just died or if he was been shot. But at any rate, the grief on his mother's face leads me to believe that he's dead. And I was in this room, but it kind of gives you an indication of how many dead people I've seen and how many victims of war. You see in the corner, his sister's holding a copy of the Quran. Two places that journalists, war reporters always go when you first arrive in a zone is a hospital, because usually you'll find a doctor who can give you a very neutral view, a neutral but tragic view of what's happening. And the other places we go to graveyards, because you can tell from the funerals that happen, even during wartime, how many people are killed. Are they children? Who is being buried? And so this kind of is the rhythm of the terrible rhythm of a war reporter. Next. That is a funeral at a graveyard. If you look around, it's all men, right? So another aspect of this is being a woman in these kind of places, in a Muslim country and in an Arab country. I always, cover up, of course, and be as respectful as I can. Even so, it's often, very difficult to work as a woman. Afghanistan was a nightmare, is a nightmare to work in. Iraq, easier. Afghanistan, I probably had the most problems I've ever encountered. Next. So the anguish of being buried by bombs. And one thing that happens to you when you're bombed, and people don't realize this, is that your roof collapses. So you're in your apartment building, the roof comes down, everyone gets buried. And at the height of all this in Aleppo, these incredibly courageous guys called the White Helmets, who were ordinary people, doctors, fathers, not doctors, sorry, because doctors were busy in the hospital. People who worked in grocery shops, there was a scuba diving instructor, teachers, students got together, and because they realized the world was not coming to save them, the international community had abandoned Syria, that they were going to help themselves. And so they learned how to dig people out of the rubble, because of course, when you get trapped by bombing, oftentimes you're still alive and you're buried deep in this kind of horrible rubble. The White Helmets, there's a wonderful documentary on Netflix about them. Believe it or not, the Russians launched an intense internet campaign to discredit them. Why? because the white helmets wore GoPro cameras on their helmets. They were white helmets, by the way, because they're humanitarians. And they were recording the Russian war crimes as they were digging these people out. So they had real-time evidence. And this is what I'm going back to, that we are recording all this. We have all of this. So when the time comes to bring Assad and his cronies to justice, to court, to trial, we're ready. We have it. Next slide. Nicole Tong, wonderful photographer. Look out for her stuff. So I think, John, should we hand it over to you for some questions now?
Certainly. Thank you so much. And if you have not already done so, folks, please go to the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and type in any questions for Janine that you'd like to share. We do have a few. I'm going to start with one, though, that why are you not broken after all this time and all you've experienced?
Because I write, and because I truly believe what I do makes a difference. And I think interestingly enough, all the studies that have been done about the effect of post-traumatic stress disorder on war reporters, I was in one of the earliest studies ever done in the American Journal of Psychiatry. And this psychiatrist, Anthony Feinstein, studied a group of us for 3 years. And at the end of it, I didn't have PTSD. And I said to him, why? And he said, because you write, so you're getting this out, and you genuinely believe that you have a mission. And, I think that sounds kind of grandiose, and I don't want to give myself that much credit, but I do feel like I have a responsibility, a very heavy responsibility that was passed to me by Felicia Langer all those years ago, but it was about bearing witness. And I believe that there are people that do not have a voice. And like in places, where wars are not being reported, like Myanmar right now, or the Rohingyas, or the Uyghurs in China, where journalists can't get to, where truth tellers can't get to. And people are suffering. Somewhere in the world right now, many places in the world right now, someone is being tortured, someone is being killed, someone's children are being taken from them. And I think if you enter this world of human rights and activism and humanitarian work, then this is your responsibility. And I hope I can do it until the day I die, as until my last breath, because it matters to me. And the fact that I've seen, there's something in the Torah. I'm not Jewish, but it says, he who saves one life saves humanity. So, I do have people that I've gotten. My godson, I got him out of Sarajevo when he was a baby. I have a young man called Mariel who's now in Kenya. And I found him in a refugee camp in South Sudan in 2014, right after a terrible war there. Both his parents had been killed in front of him. He was an unaccompanied minor. A friend who worked for UNICEF brought me to him. And I just thought, I've got to get this boy out of here, because he's going to be a child. If I don't, the warlords will prey on him. He'll become a child soldier. And something about him, I mean, there were thousands of people there who were in need of help, but he was one. And I managed, like with the help of UN colleagues, to get him to Uganda. With the help of a wealthy friend, I got him into a boarding school. And today he is 20 and at university studying petroleum engineering. So, you can make a difference, and you don't have to be in a war zone. There are many people I know in Maine now who have been resettled, in Lewiston and in many places all over the world, where you could help people who are in need of help. Other Americans, people during COVID, and I really truly believe that it has a knock-on effect. Once you open yourself up to this kind of, that we're, otherwise, why are we here? Why are we on this planet if we weren't here to look after each other? And in my case, it's been in extremis, right? Not everyone has the ability or the resources to go to these war-torn countries, but I have been. So I do see it as a kind of mission. And I suppose that is why I'm not broken. That doesn't mean I haven't cried. When I watched Quo Vadis Aida, I sobbed for 103 minutes of that film. I could not stop crying. And in many ways, I hold myself and the international community responsible for what happened both in Rwanda and Srebrenica, because 1 million people died in Rwanda, 8,000 in Srebrenica, and all of them should be alive today. That was purely cynical acts of the international community not to protect these people. So, we trudge on and we move from trying, maybe there were failures and those were failures, but now maybe we can help people in other places. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
It's a good one. And can you just follow up on that? Why do you hold yourself responsible for something that was so enormous, despite everything you were doing and others were doing to chronicle what was happening and to let the world know? Why do you help us understand why you feel you failed in some way?
Because if you were there, I think if you were there witnessing it and struggling, in the case of Bosnia, for 3 years, we knew that Srebrenica was besieged. And literally, I would be on the radio with people inside and they would be saying, in the name of God, do something. They knew they were going to be slaughtered. They knew their town was going to be overrun and they were going to be slaughtered. So we, the journalists, were basically just conduits to the outside world. And believe me, in the case of Bosnia, I'm very proud of what my colleagues and I did, because some of my stories were read on the floor of Parliament, and Margaret Thatcher raised high holy hell that the international community had to do things. The story I told you about the blind, that was read, that was a front page story in the Times of London. And so as a result, the Royal Institute of the Blind in London tried to get help to them. And so I do think, back to your question, no, I'm not Kofi Annan, who, made the decisions to pull out the troops as he was head of Department of Peacekeeping Operations at the UN. That those decisions were far higher than me, but I was there. So if living through Bosnia, living through Rwanda, Syria, I felt tremendous responsibility when Aleppo fell, because I felt that we struggled to bring the reality of the horror of the bombing of Aleppo, the destruction of one of the oldest inhabited cities on earth. And we failed. And the day that Aleppo fell, I can tell you that I really had a very, very dark day, and I cried and I cried. And so, I also think it's very healthy to have these emotions, and to recognize them, because I go to very, very dark places and I take in a lot of darkness. So I have to be pretty strong to withstand that.
There's a question that was submitted that fits right into that point you just made. It said, how can you find the good in people after seeing how horrible they treat each other?
Because look at the white helmets. Because look at the people who I've seen in war. In war does, I always say, there's a real dichotomy, right? You get true evil, and I mean true evil. And I have been with war criminals who I want to reach across and choke them to death. But that's not my role. My role is to actually understand what they're doing so that I can write about them and shame them and hopefully bring them eventually to a war crimes tribunal by documenting their evidence of their murders and worse, torture. But I think that, sorry, I lost track of that question. I just went on a roll. What was the?
Well, just the question about how can you see the good in people?
Oh, right. Okay.
When you
So
see so much.
I absolutely see the good in people, because in war zones, I was saying the evil, the good. I've seen tremendous courage. I mean, and I don't mean soldiers. I mean ordinary people, the most ordinary people that, sometimes illiterate, who decide that, okay, I'm doing a project for UNICEF right now, and I just read something about these two 13-year-old and a 14-year-old who landed in that camp in Lesbos in Greece, Maria, which was which had a terrible fire last September. And these two, like, they saw these kids and they realized that these kids are hungry for an education. And so they started their own school called School for the Stars, and they're 13 years old. So I see in people, in human beings, in all of us, like tremendous resilience and tremendous endurance. And, you know, you only need to look at Holocaust survivors who went on. I'm right now reading Viktor Frankl's Man's Quest for Meaning. And, you know, people can survive horrific things and forgive. You know, look at Nelson Mandela. The whole process of healing in South Africa was based on his forgiveness. You know, what had been done to people during apartheid was horrific. But instead of bearing hate, he realized that hate stops any kind of peaceful transition. And interestingly enough, Rwanda, which was one of the most brutal things I'd ever seen, a genocide of 1 million people in 3 months. And these people weren't assassinated largely with bullets. Many of them were killed with machetes, which is labor intensive killing. So the piles and piles of bodies, sometimes like mothers holding their children, you would think that people that underwent that kind of trauma would never be able to forgive. But Rwanda is one of the cases we often look to as a successful post-conflict resolution, because it is embedded in their constitution that they cannot, you know, call each other Hutus and Tutsis, the tribes that the Hutus massacred the Tutsis. And I've met survivors, genocide. A young man recently who saw the dogs eating his father's body after his father was macheted, and whose entire family was killed. And this guy now today, Hippolyte, he's called, is kind of an inspirational speaker in Rwanda about forgiveness and about like the lessons of not harboring hate, because it's hate that brings about nationalism and populism. I mean, we only have to look at our own country over the past 4 years and saw what happened here, you know, and what it could have become. And you know, what leads to healing is forgiveness.
You've mentioned that, I don't know if you said it today, but in other contexts, about your upbringing in the Catholic faith. What is your faith life, or what is your sense of spirituality and faith now, based on what you've seen over the last 3 to 4 decades?
Even stronger. I mean, you know, first of all, I believe that I had guardian angels that protected me, because the number of times I was nearly killed are too many to go into here. Like literally assassinate, you know, I was marched into the woods by Serbian paramilitaries, had a gun pointed at, you know, basically a mock execution. The number of times I was caught in bombing raids that, you know, and so first of all, I do think I have guardian angels. And second, I truly believe, you know, and I've had this question over and over with theologians. And my next book, of course, is about the strength of Christianity in these countries where the Islamic State overran them, burned their villages, stole their farmland, took their wives and daughters and brought them to Raqqa and sold them on a platform like animals. And these people, to go into those masses in Mosul and hear them praying in Aramaic, you realize the deep faith that people have. Now, I'm not saying you can't survive in a war zone if you don't have faith. I'm just saying that for me, it was critical, and it still is today. It's, you know, it defines the person I am, essentially. And I feel very blessed to have that, because I have many friends who say, you know, I wish I had that core, that inner faith. And you know, I ultimately believe that despite all the evil in the world, that there is goodness, you know, and that someone told me something wonderful, which is very reassuring. Just last week, she said, sleep well, God is awake. And, you know, God could be Yahweh or Allah, or it doesn't matter. It's just something that you believe in that is protecting us. And I do believe that. it's an argument that could be picked apart, of course, but
Got a couple of questions that deal with the role of the world community and the role of the United States in helping people under siege. Can you talk about your thoughts on that role, the internationalist, humanitarian role of world countries, world powers?
yes. So look, after the horrors of Srebrenica 1995 and Rwanda 1994, Kofi Annan, who then became Secretary General, launched a mechanism in the UN called the Responsibility to Protect. And this basically means that as the world governance, the UN had the responsibility to protect vulnerable people. In truth, that responsibility to protect is pretty toothless. But I do think, and I have seen every time I've been with soldiers, American soldiers in Iraq or Afghanistan, British soldiers, I genuinely, especially the really young ones, like they're there because they really think they're there helping people. Now, I believe that Iraq should not have been invaded. And I believe that very strongly because I was on the ground before the invasion for a long time. And I knew the Iraqi people would never, ever tolerate an occupation. And that's what it was. It was meant to free the people from the regime of Saddam Hussein. But in my view, that was their responsibility. And they would have done it eventually, like the Arab Spring. You know, the people rose up in Tunisia and got rid of Ben Ali. They got rid of Mubarak in Egypt. They got rid of Gaddafi in Libya. So it was the responsibility of the people. It wasn't a violation of the sovereignty, which happened. Afghanistan, as we know, because we're pulling out after 20 years, was a nightmare and a disaster and a doomed mission, despite the incredibly brave, heroic actions of men and women that fought there. So what is our role? I believe as a wealthy, strong country, we do have a responsibility to protect people, but not just for strategic, greedy reasons. Not for Iraq because the Bushes want oil, the Bushes and their cronies. Not to intervene in Israel because Jared Kushner wants to get his real estate deals signed by, the Gulf. But genuinely to help people because, as I said earlier, why else are we on this planet if not to help each other? Now, you might be sitting in a place where you're not able in the way I'm able to do something, but you certainly are able to support people, whether it's to support the white helmets or to be aware. That's the first step, I think, is a lot of people, don't know what's going on in China with the Uyghurs or the Rohingya or Syria. What actually is still happening there, because that's a war that's still going on. And I think, to see people not as the other, but as our brothers and sisters, we absolutely have a responsibility on this earth to do that. Complicated question.
No, and there are a couple of others that have come in that relate to that. You said it's important to become aware, and it's not. We have a question here saying, how can ordinary people become activists and not just armchair activists without following your lead and going to these places and immersing yourself in what's happening?
Well, please don't go to these places because Kyla Muller was a young American woman I met on the border of Syria, and she was a young college student. She had just graduated, who wanted to be a humanitarian. And she was, I think, she thought it would be glamorous, but as you might know, Kyla Muller drove over the border, was kidnapped by the Islamic State, taken to Raqqa, and married to al-Baghdadi. And was killed in a American bombing raid to expel the Islamic State. So, and I remember seeing her and thinking, my God, you can't go to these places unless you have skill, right? So I've been doing it for more than 35 years now. And I can just tell you, you don't rock up in a dangerous place, and you really need to know what you're doing. But having said that, that doesn't mean you can't sponsor children in South Sudan, or you can't support humanitarian groups that are doing good work. You can't help refugees in your own town. You can't help separated children at the border. You can't foster a child in need. I mean, I think about all the time. I read about children in foster care in America. There was just a story about the state of Alaska stealing their funds, and I think, God, why aren't I fostering 2 or 3 kids right now? You know, each one of us, and I can't tell you, okay, go to this website or go to that website. You need to do some research where you are, and whatever it is your cause might be. You might have a special passion for helping farming, right? And like, how can you help Yemen, which is right now going through a terrible war, but also a famine? Is there some expertise you have that might help some NGO that's working in Yemen? I mean, you have to work this out on your own. I can't really, say individually what you can do, but absolutely, everyone can do something. And now that we have internet, it makes it so much easier. So all you need to do is Google the white helmets, or NGOs working in farming in Yemen, or training young teachers in Burundi, or whatever. And then, of course, there's the Peace Corps, which takes people of all ages. That's a heavy duty thing, though. I wouldn't recommend, on the other hand, I know a lot of you have passion, but you also have to think it through. Like, not everyone was designed to go live in a village in Ivory Coast for 2 years and build wells. Some of you were, but not everyone. So I always tell this to my students who say, I want to be a war reporter. And I just think, there's a handful of people on earth who are designed, who are built, who are given that mission to do that. It's not for everyone. And it's not for everyone to witness this kind of stuff. So, but there are things you can do, and you could start by looking in your own community.
I have a few questions that pertain to your advice on the consumption of media and helping all of us understand what, in your opinion, are the most reliable sources of information about world conflict. What are those news sources, print, digital, broadcast, that you have the most confidence in?
Okay, so I'll tell you what I read. I read the New York Times every day, even though I'm getting disappointed in it. I read the Washington Post. I read Foreign Policy, and I get Foreign Affairs, which is a publication from the Council on Foreign Relations. I wouldn't recommend Foreign Affairs to all of you unless you're a real policy nerd. Foreign Policy is brilliant, and I urge all of you to subscribe to it. It's really well written. I'm a columnist on it, but it's also it gives you, like, really, like right now, like, I'm very disturbed by what's happening in India with COVID, and you'll find the best pieces about that. Or let's say you want to know more about what's happening in China with the Uyghurs, who are desperately being persecuted. That's the place to go to. The other thing I read a lot of, and again, this is for those of you who want to go deeper, is I read a lot of reports. So I rely on the Council on Foreign Relations, which you can Google, cfr.org. And, virtually any topic, there will be a paper on it. So whether it's democracy or governance or human rights or transitional justice, it's there, and countries, and there are experts. And I know, because I was there for a year with an office working on things there, that you really get like the top-notch policy people. I'm not saying I was the top-notch, but I'm just saying I knew them. So like next door to me was probably like the best China expert in the United States, a woman, Dr. Elizabeth Economy, the best Turkish experts, the best. So the Council on Foreign Relations. Human Rights Watch does really good reports. Again, I think it's humanrightshrw.org. You can find it online. I rely a lot on something called the International Crisis Group, which we call Crisis Group, ICG. And they also do reports, like in-depth reports, country by country. So let's say you want to know what's going on in Lebanon. You get their report. I don't, outside of that, I don't read a lot of magazines anymore. I read Harper's. I write for them as well. Very good magazine, long articles. The Atlantic. That's about it. I don't watch television. I'm sorry. I listen to the radio. I listen to NPR, which I really trust, and I listen to the BBC World Service. Occasionally, I'll look at the BBC's website. I don't read any other websites really. Once in a blue moon, I'll go to CNN's just if I need to know quickly what's going on with something domestically. Like, for instance, the George Floyd trial. I want it like a minute by minute thing. And I went to there, but I don't watch TV at all. I don't even own a TV.
All right. And my reaction, this pause wasn't to the fact that you don't own a TV. I admire that. I'm just reading, we have a question that just came in that said, you mentioned that the last war that reporters impacted foreign policy on was Bosnia. Does that mean, in your opinion, that the media no longer have the influence or have an influence on international conflict?
Well, you know, I should say, I shouldn't put it in such black and white terms because absolutely the media does have an effect, right? But I think less and less, also because there's so much content out there. You know, there's Afghanistan alone right now. I mean, every outlet is writing about it. So I do think that, yeah, I mean, I think the sad truth is I do think we have less. I think President Biden will pay more attention to it, but I think certainly President Trump didn't care what was going on well, actually, it's interesting because my Syrian friends really like Trump because they said that at least he reacted to the chemical gas attack and launched a bombing raid. Not a very large one, but he did something. Whereas Obama, who I'm a huge devoted fan of, backed away in 2013 after Ghouta was chemically gassed. And I mean, you know, I have friends who were gassed, chemically gassed, whose hearts stopped and who were revived. And as you remember, back in 2013, Obama said there was a red line that would be drawn. And if Assad crossed that red line, the international community would go in, and he backed out. And so I will always say, with huge respect to President Obama, on Syria, he was disastrous. But again, he came into office with the policy of getting the US out of wars, not into. Now, at that point, I truly believe if he had short strategic strikes, the war would be ended now, and there wouldn't be 500,000 people dead in Syria. That didn't happen. And now Bashar al-Assad, the bad guy, has effectively won the war and will preside over that country. So what happens when a bad guy wins the war? How do refugees ever go back? How do they ever feel safe? If you're a dissident or you are in the opposition, you know you're going to be sent straight to prison, tortured to death. So it leaves the international community in a very dubious position of witnessing this and not really rushing to the aid.
Can we go back to Afghanistan? What is your thoughts about what Afghanistan? What is going to happen to Afghani people after September when all the American troops are withdrawn?
You know, Afghanistan is the one country I really, really did not like working in at all because I found it, the treatment of women, the primitive conditions. I mean, one of the first things I remember is after the Taliban fell, going into Kabul, going into a hospital, and a hospital for women, a maternity hospital, and finding women chained to the beds. And the nurses said, oh, well, they're crazy. And they weren't crazy. They had just given birth, and they, you know, had postpartum depression or something. The girls being kept from education, the healthcare, the rate of newborn death, mortality. I think, okay, there is a school of thought that believes the Taliban are becoming more moderate. I do not believe this. I believe, you know, they are in the world's eye, and since we are negotiating with them, there is one thing about them that is true. They always do what they say they're going to do. They're very consistent. Well, the US is pulling out. We've started the withdrawal, and hopefully President Biden says that by the anniversary of 9/11, all troops will be out. I think Afghanistan will probably revert back to Taliban rule, Taliban fear. I mean, remember that Afghanistan until 9/11, while the Taliban were ruling, was closed off to the world. It wasn't just journalists that weren't allowed there, it was humanitarians. For a long time, Doctors Without Borders had one hospital in the Panjshir Valley, and there was another hospital run by an Italian humanitarian called Emergency, and that was it. So Afghanistan is vast, and there's a very good book for those of you. I just reviewed it for Foreign Policy. If you follow me on Twitter, which is at Janine DG, you'll see my review of it. It's called The Hardest Place, and it's by a young reporter called Wesley Morgan, who embedded with an American unit in the toughest place in the Kosovo Valley. And it's basically about like what they sustained. I think it's time they withdrew. I'm not unhappy about this climbing down in Afghanistan because I think it's a quagmire. And, you know, the Russians couldn't sustain, you know, Afghanistan broke the Soviet Union back in '79. There was no way we were going to sustain keeping troops there for this long. So I am not unhappy about the withdrawal, but I am worried about what's going to happen. And also regionally, right? So Afghanistan, one of the reasons we took such care with it was not just that it was sheltering Osama bin Laden, but because of the region, the neighbors, Pakistan, Iran, China. It's right in the middle of, you know, a geopolitically charged area.
We get time for a couple more questions. So folks, if you have more, please post them in the Q&A.
There's some on the Q&A, like,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
okay, you've got this.
Yeah.
Okay.
One of them gets back to something you said at the very beginning, where you wish you had had somebody that could have taught you how to interview survivors of trauma. How would you prepare somebody? How are you preparing people who are going into those situations, whether they're domestic trauma or global trauma?
Okay, so Michael, this is for your journalism students out there. I'll give you interviewing 101 briefly. First of all, you have to be very aware that, I mean, the people I interview have been deeply, deeply, deeply traumatized. So I'm talking about, you know, women who've come out of these rape camps, who've been raped 16 times a day, or have given birth to children as a result of it, or torture victims. My Syria book basically was talking to people that had been severely tortured. And I mean severely. I mean, some of the most horrible stories I've ever heard. So you first have to make sure they're in a safe place. Like, so you don't, you know, you make sure like they feel safe. You make sure that if they want to have someone with them, it could be their sister or their mother or a cousin, you know, do you want to have someone with you? And you ensure above all that they are in a safe place. The second thing is that traumatized people's sense of timing and memory is very distorted because it's something happens to the brain, right? When you're deeply traumatized, and they may jump back and forth in time. You need to be incredibly patient, and this is where you hone your skills as a listener. Now, those of you out there who are psychotherapists or work or are faith-based leaders, you know how to listen to people. But listening skills have to be basically honed because most of us do not listen. And when I say listen, I mean you're not just hearing, you're reading their body language. Are they uncomfortable? Are they scared? Do I need to stop? Do I need to come back another day? All this has to be taken into account. It cannot be rushed. So when you see television reporters running up to someone after a hurricane going, how do you feel? This is like the worst thing you can do. You know, you you start off by asking a simple question, which to me is a great question. It's, what happened to you? That's it. What happened to you? Let them tell their story. Don't judge them. Be careful of your language. Like, for instance, rape victims do not like to be called victims, they're survivors. Be careful of your language. Be careful that you yourself aren't, in some way, your body language isn't imposing on their boundaries. So it's really an act of being hypersensitive, hypersensitive. I never record stuff unless it's a head of state. And the reason I don't do that is because it freaks people out, right? So I'm just a very good note taker. I worked at the AP, it was my first job. So I take really, really careful notes. If you insist on recording someone, ask their permission first, say, do you mind if I record you? Personally, I wouldn't do that, but that's up to you. But do ask their permission first. The same with a Zoom call. And gradually let them tell their story in their own words. See yourself as, in a sense, a vessel. They can't bring their story to the world, but you can. But you have to listen. So you're there to kind of gently get these traumatic memories from them. They might cry. They usually do. They might shake. And the other thing is, stop when things are really heavy. Stop. Don't ever push anyone to talk to you. There are people who will want to talk to you, and they'll want to tell their stories, whether it's a woman, a victim of domestic abuse, or a child who's been sexually violated. Working with children is a whole other area, by the way. And I've worked with children for years in Gaza, traumatized children. Another tactic, interestingly, is to get them to draw things, children especially, because they sometimes they can't express themselves, but they can, they can show you what they're feeling by drawing an airplane dropping bombs, or a picture of their father being dragged out in the middle of the night by soldiers, or something like that. And this drawing also reveals a lot. If you're a photographer or a film person, your task is really difficult. Someone asked if I take pictures. Never, absolutely never, because I can only do one thing at a time. I'm not a multitasker. So I take a couple snapshots when I'm working, but I absolutely do not. I'm not a photojournalist. I'm a writer. And I can't be the photographer and the writer at the same time. Those of you who are photographers and filmmakers, and you're doing this kind of work, you've got a whole other issue, which is really tough. And I would recommend that you take my friend Nicole Tung's, she's doing actually a seminar in this. You can, if you follow me on Twitter, again, like I posted her class. Because I couldn't begin to tell you how hard it is to film and to photograph people in this kind of distress. It's hard enough to get testimonies.
There are two questions we want to end with. One that deals with global perspective, and another is a lot closer to home. I'm going to start with a global perspective one. Question asks, do you consider that a part of your work is to convince American politicians and the American people that investing in international issues and people, the international affairs budget, is not only important to those foreign countries, but also important to Americans?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at what the founding fathers, what this country was founded on, the Jeffersonian democracy, part of our mandate, in a way, and it goes back to protection. If we have the ability to do that, then we should, and it shouldn't be for strategic or greed or economic means alone. I was reading about World War II and the Marshall Plan, and I never realized that the Marshall Plan essentially was was about trade. It wasn't about rebuilding the countries. It was about getting American trade in there. Or Iraq was about oil. If we go to help Syria, it's because we're going to help the Syrian people. Now, I think that absolutely, in answer to your question, I do see my role as that. And when I was at the Council on Foreign Relations, I did go to Washington a lot and brief various congressmen and one time the vice president's office about Christians in the Middle East who are being driven off the face of the earth. And I'm constantly, anytime I can, on a panel or speaking out or trying to raise awareness as much as I can. But I'm one person, and I'm not a lobbyist. I'm essentially like, I know my job, I do my job, and then that message carries forth. And I'm also very happy that I work for the UN as well, because that makes me feel that I actually have very tangible, like the project I'm doing, training these young Yemeni, Syrian, Iraqi truth tellers, and they're human rights activists, they're lawyers, they are, some of them are doctors, some of them are journalists, because I want them to go back to their home countries and to teach other people what I have taught them. And that way, they can tell the stories of their own countries, the historical narrative of what happened. Because an interesting thing about war is that, to me, it all comes down to historical narrative. Like, if you look at the former Yugoslavia, if you talk to the Serbs, it's all about what happened to them, their victimization in World War II. And they go all the way back to 1389, the Battle of Kosovo Polje, an oppressive Ottoman regime. But if you speak to the Bosnians, there's a whole other story. It's the same with Israel-Palestine. If you speak to the Israelis, this is their land, it's given to them by God. If you speak to the Palestinians, they were there first. So, it's understanding people's historical narratives and recording them. And in a sense, trying not to judge. It's very clear to anyone when I work in Israel-Palestine who gets my sympathy more. And it's the victims of occupation, because living under occupation for anyone is horrific. Human beings are not meant to be occupied. But I think the question of getting it out to policy is then I do my job, I get it out there. It's then up to the politicians to carry it further.
Want to end with a question that, or a statement. I know that you were very close friend and admirer of a faculty member who recently passed away, Professor Charles Scontras. Yeah. And he was a huge fan of you and all of your work. Would you like to talk about his influence on you and how you first met him? And
I really, when I said Felicia Langer, I should go back to Charlie Scontras. He was an extraordinary man. And his classes, like, that's probably the one class, I don't remember my English classes at all, but I remember his class because you went into it. And first of all, it was very hard to get into. And then, like, day one, he would take a book and hurl it to kind of get our attention and to wake us up. And he was a humanitarian in the strongest sense of the word. And after he passed away, I wrote to both his children. And, I felt that having met him, and like once in your life, maybe once or twice in your life, you meet people who kind of put you on the direction that you're on. And I definitely feel like he had that kind of influence on me, because it showed me that the world was bigger than what all my friends were going to work on Wall Street. And this was when I graduated in 1983. It was the height of the Wolf of Wall Street. So all my friends were either going to Wall Street or we were all trying to get jobs. But he made me think that there were other things, and those other things were, looking after people that couldn't look after themselves. He was a union organizer. He started his career. He started his life as a shoemaker, and he then organized the cobblers in Maine into unions, and then he became a union activist. So his lifetime was devoted to the working man, and in a sense, my life has been devoted to it sounds too corny to say it, but to the downtrodden. And there's this wonderful expression that I often quote, and I'm going to misquote it again, which basically says, it's from Seneca, and it says, you have been, if you give me a second, I will actually find it on my computer. Can you give me a minute? Because I think it's a good thing to end this talk with. Let me see if I could find it on my computer. Okay, so just one second. But this reminded me very much of Charlie Scontras and his what we are called to do. Okay. All right. Okay. No. I found another one, but but hang on. No, but basically what it says is that, what are you doing? Like, what are you, why are you here? You have been called, it says something like, to save the shipwrecked, to feed the hungry, to help the poor. Why else are you here? Time is running out. You're here for a reason. Again, not everyone on this call is going to be able to pack their bag and go to Syria or go to Yemen or go to Iraq tomorrow, but certainly in your own town, in your own village, in your own street, there's someone who needs help, who needs assistance, who needs someone to listen to them, who needs someone to reach out to them. And Charlie Scontras's class gave me that. It gave me a sense of humanity, that we're not alone here, and we're here for a reason, and we're here, and it's not always easy. And a lot of times you don't get accolades, and you don't get talks on Zoom, and you don't get praised for what you've done, but you're doing it quietly, and you're doing it because you too have a mission on this earth. And I think that's what I learned from him. And, God rest his soul, because he was a beautiful human being. And anyone on this call who was lucky enough to have one of his classes knows exactly what I'm saying. He was a remarkable man.
That's great. Well, it's fitting that we are ending the Allan Muller lecture, who was a person who was very influential and instrumental in the lives of others, with a person that was also, in his own way, very instrumental in the lives. And it's so nice to hear you reflect on him, because he was a super person. Anybody who ever knew him or worked with him understood exactly what you're saying. Janine, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.
And I'm sorry that you're not able to be on campus now, but we hope
I am too.
We'll get you back. And Michael, I don't know if you have any closing words that you'd like to share.
No, I'd just like to thank you again. That was wonderful, a wonderful talk.
Pleasure. And I really hope to come to campus and we could do another one of these talks in person. I would really love to do that. And good luck to everyone, all you aspiring writers, or those of you who are seeking to do something good in the world. I encourage you, and I salute you on your way. So someone asked one question though. I do, and they said, how do you transition from college to the real world? And I just want to say, it took me a long time. I went to Iowa and I waitressed, and I went overseas, and it takes time. So be patient with yourself, especially in this post-COVID world, not yet even post-COVID. Be very gentle with yourself, but do have a focus, know what you want, have a goal, and go for it. Don't let anyone stand in your way. Don't let anyone tell you you can't do it, or you can't get into that graduate school, or you can't get that job, or you didn't go to you didn't go to Harvard, so therefore you're not going to be working in the government. Just have a focus, and a very clear focus. I always knew I wanted to be a writer. I didn't know how. I didn't know how I'd get there. I didn't know the steps to do it, but I just knew I wanted to do it. And I really think it was that propelled me to it. So I ask you to keep that in yourselves. What is it you want to do? Where do you want to go? And just keep going forward. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all. And on behalf of the Alumni Association, the Department of Communication and Journalism, and the Maine Humanities Center, excuse me, Michael, did I get that wrong? I said the Maine Humanities Center.
The McGillicuddy Humanities.
McGillicuddy, I apologize to the McGillicuddies for shortchanging them on that, but thank you all for joining us. We will be sending everybody who registered for this webinar links to Janine's website, her personal website, where you could order books.
And Twitter, please.
and
You can follow me on
follow-
Twitter too. Yeah.
Twitter. And we'll also be sending you a link to a great profile of Janine that Kathy Olmsted, a former faculty member and department chair and member of the Maine Press Hall of Fame, wrote about Janine for last summer's Alumni magazine. Probably we'll throw in some other things as well about Janine, but so you haven't heard the end of her, and we look forward to having you back, Janine. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye. Thanks so much.